My name is Achieng Akena. I'm the Executive Director of the Pan-African Citizens Network. The Pan-African Citizens Network started off in 2007 as the Center for Citizens Participation in the African Union. It was initiated as a recognition that there weren't many Africans that were knowledgeable about or participating in African Union spaces. The purpose of the organization is really to increase civil society engagement in African Union spaces and to increase citizen participation, so that at the end of the day we do have an Africa that has its people at its center. I would say that Africa is not harnessing its demographic dividends because we see a lot of shortcomings in our democratic spaces. Despite most of our countries having been or being 50 plus years in terms of independence, we are not as far as we would have liked to see. The ideals that were crafted 50 years ago by what we call the founding fathers of the continent have still not been realized. Just in terms of basic things, in terms of integration, free movement, in the national context, right to free expression, right to freedom of assembly. Basic human rights and human needs are still yet to be realized in many of our countries and in our contexts. Basic health services, education, we're not where we should be 50 years on. I think that civil society organizations need to have a bigger role than they do right now, which is mostly as band-aid for governmental deficits. Civil society organizations tend to fill in the spaces that government leaves out. So they play checks and balances kind of role, but even then not as robustly as they could, because they face a lot of oppression. There's a lot of shrinking of the space for civil society action. So governments need to appreciate civil society as a necessary part of a state, rather than seeing them as they like to claim that they're foreign force, they're foreign entities that are not vested in the national interest. People who work in civil society organizations are citizens who face the daily challenges that every other citizen faces. And they have a huge role that they can play, but half the time they are doing firefighting, trying to reclaim their spaces, trying to remain in operation because of the oppressive laws and practices that governments have against civil society on the continent. There are a lot of challenges that young people face, but I think that they all stem from the fact that young people, like other citizens, are not seen for the value and the resource that they are on the continent. They are seen as a problematic that require to be managed and controlled. And we keep referring to them as leaders of tomorrow. When in reality, all the ills that face our societies today impact young people even more. Whether you talk about unemployment, young people, because of the position that they stand in, they're most affected by issues of unemployment, by issues of lack of healthcare, by issues of insufficient educational systems. But it's also, and if you'll allow me to reference the migration issue that has been under discussion at this conference, in the streets of Nairobi, I see a lot of young white people in the streets who come to do work in Kenya. So they tend to be referred to as volunteers and interns, and they tend to be referred to as expats. But when our young people go out to look for opportunities, they're referred to as illegal immigrants. And for me, what I see is a lack of that. In their context, they are valued as a national resource, and government invests in providing them with scholarships so that they can get opportunities to learn and understand better the work that they will be doing. In our part, young people are not seen as a resource, and there are no investments that are made in young people, and so they become desperate and find any way to cross over. And so I feel that the problem is in how we value our citizens and how we value our young people. I think what we need more is a lot more of on the continent is value-based leadership. Leaders that believe in the principles of inclusion and participation, and that see value in the African person. That definitely needs to change. And if that changes, what happens is spaces begin to open up. When you value the input of your citizens, whether through citizen formations like NGOs, or through the media, or through political parties, when you start to give value to these, then other things fall in line. Because I believe that the institutional and normative frameworks do exist for citizen participation, for youth participation, for democratic governance. Whether you're talking about the Democracy Charter, you're talking about national constitutions, the normative and institutional frameworks exist. Now, if we have value-led leadership, then these frameworks will have an opportunity to actually be realized, and the potential of Africans, especially young Africans, will begin to be realized on the continent. The two key trends that I have noticed. One, since the adoption of the Democracy Charter. One would be a recognition by Africans of their power and potential. So we've seen a lot more Africans interested in and participating in democratic change in their countries. And I think that wasn't so much of a trend before the adoption of AGA. So I think it's what Dr. Matlosa referred to as the AU recognizing the power of the people, or the will of the people. And that's an interesting trend that has a lot of potential, to do good if it is well managed. Unfortunately, at the moment, it's not very well managed, and what we're seeing is repression and oppression of citizens' participation in the democratic space, whether through street protests or through wanting to engage more in electoral processes, rather than it being embraced and enhanced as a growth in the democratic trends in the continent. We're seeing more of oppression and suppression of it. The second trend that I have seen across the continent is governments are being more careful, I suppose is the way you could put it, about issues of democracy. They are less willing to be criticized and less willing to be found on the wrong side of the democratic culture, which is something that we never used to see before. And I do see it as a plus, ironically, because even though it leads to increased oppression, and even though it leads to a capturing of the discourse and the language by governments, I think it is a positive trend because they are actually caring more about the principles and tenets of democratic governance. Of course, more needs to be done. Of course, they need to take more seriously their commitments and obligations, whether at regional or continental institutional spaces. But I think that looking back, we've come a long way since AGDEG was adopted 10 years ago.